Welcome to the Explainer. So, today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to take the story we've all been told about Western civilization and completely flip it on its head. We're diving into the work of Aram Shenturk to explore this really powerful counter-narrative. The idea here is that the whole glittering story of progress, well, it might just be built on something much, much darker. All right, let's get right into it. The whole argument from our source material really boils down to this, and it's simple, but it's also incredibly profound. The story we hear is that Western wealth came from being smarter, right? From investing in science. But this perspective says, nope, that's not the real story. The real story is one of systematic plunder, a story that's been very carefully and deliberately covered up. So to really get our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll tackle what's called the grand illusion, the idea of history itself. Then we're going to look at the so-called heroes of the story. After that, we'll get into the actual tools they used to build these empires. Then, the really tough part, the brutal, bloody price tag of it all. And finally, we'll see how this system, according to the source, is still very much alive today. Okay, first up, the grand illusion. The core argument here is that the official history we read in textbooks is like this beautiful, polished storefront. But behind it, a much grimmer reality. You see, this story didn't just happen, it was built, it was constructed. So the big question is, what was it built on? Well, according to this counter-narrative, it all starts with the theft of ideas. The source points to research like a book by George James called Stolen Legacy, which makes a pretty bold claim that what we call Greek philosophy wasn't Greek at all. It was actually taken from ancient Egypt. The story goes that after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, Aristotle and his crew got their hands on everything in the great libraries there and, well, pretty much passed off all that Egyptian knowledge as their own. Okay, so if the foundational ideas were stolen, what about the heroes who supposedly spread them? This is where we get to the age of discovery. And from this viewpoint, it's not about exploration at all. It's reframed as the beginning of a massive global colonial project. And this slide really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Let's take a guy like Captain James Cook. In the textbook version, he's this amazing explorer, a celebrated navigator. But in this counter-narrative, he's seen as a colonial invader, a murderer even, someone who discovered a continent that was already home to a civilization with a, 90,000-year history. It's a completely different picture. So you might be asking, how on earth did they justify this legally? Well, they had a very powerful tool, a doctrine called terra nullius, which literally means ownerless lands. This was a concept that came from the Pope, and it basically said that if the people living on a piece of land weren't Christian, then their land was legally empty, ownerless, free for the taking. Think about that. An entire continent, bustling with people, declared vacant with just the stroke of a pen. It's wild. Okay, so once they had the legal cover, the argument is that building an empire wasn't some random, chaotic thing. No, it was a system, a repeatable playbook, a process designed for one thing and one thing only: extraction. And what's crazy is how consistent this process was, all over the world. It almost always started with trade. A few merchants show up, they set up a small base, then they bring in soldiers, for protection. And before you know it, that small base is a fortress, and that fortress becomes the command center for a total takeover of the entire country. A four-step plan. Now, a really key tool in this playbook was the plantation. And the source is super clear about this. We're not just talking about a farm here. A plantation was a colonial system. It was all about forced labor growing a single cash crop. Think sugar, rubber, stuff like that. And the goal? It had nothing to do with feeding the local population, not at all. It was all about squeezing every last drop of profit out for the empire. But the argument goes even deeper. It claims that even science, the pure pursuit of knowledge, was twisted to serve the empire. You take these highly respected institutions, like Britain's Royal Society, and in this view, they weren't just hubs for brilliant minds. They were basically the research and development department for the whole colonial project. Their main goal? Figure out how to make the empire even more profitable. And the examples are pretty incredible when you think about it. You had botanists searching for cheap, high-calorie foods like breadfruit, not for humanitarian reasons, but to feed enslaved people more efficiently. You had astronomers perfecting navigation, not just to map the stars, but to guide military ships and pirate fleets. So in this view, science wasn't this pure, noble thing. It was a weapon, a tool for domination. But this system, this whole machine of extraction, it wasn't just efficient. The source argues it was built on a foundation of just unimaginable brutality. All that so-called progress came with a price tag, a very, very bloody one. And the source gives us a truly horrifying case study, the Belgian Congo. Now, what's important to understand here is that this wasn't even a regular colony. It was the personal property of one man, King Leopold II. And he ran it like his own private, brutal labor camp, all for the incredibly profitable rubber trade. The profits he made were astronomical, but the human cost, it's almost impossible to comprehend. This number you see, 10 million plus, that's the estimated number of people who died under Leopold's rule. A genocide that might have wiped out half the population of the Congo in just a few short decades. And the way this terror was enforced, it was done with horrific, systematic precision. The rubber quotas were impossible to meet, so the colonial agents came up with a system of mutilation. If workers didn't bring back enough rubber, their hands were cut off. Sometimes it was their children's hands. These severed hands became the grisly bookkeeping for the entire operation. That was the price of rubber. And the violence, according to the source, wasn't just about physical killing. It was also about cultural genocide, a systematic attempt to completely erase a people's way of life. And for this, Australia's Stolen Generations is held up as a key example. You see, they passed laws like the Aborigines Protection Act back in 1915 that gave the government the power to just take Indigenous children from their families. And if you look at the rules here, every single one was designed for one purpose: to completely sever the connection between a child and their family, their language, their culture. The source frames this as a cold, calculated strategy to break the chain of culture and essentially engineer an entire people out of existence. So this brings us to today, because the argument doesn't just stop in the past, it brings it right into the present. The claim is that while the soldiers and the governors might be gone, the system of control and extraction hasn't disappeared. It's just evolved. It's taken on a new, much more subtle form. And here's the idea. Physical colonialism has been replaced by financial colonialism. The old chains of military occupation are gone, and in their place are the new chains of debt. By trapping developing nations in these endless cycles of debt, powerful external institutions can basically call the shots on their economic policy. And this ensures that wealth just keeps flowing from the global south to the north. And this chart gives you a really stark picture of what that looks like in the real world. The source points to a country like Ghana. Look at this. The government is forced to spend more of its money, its own national budget, on paying just the interest on foreign debt than it does on health and education for its own citizens. The wealth is literally being siphoned away before it can ever be used to help the actual people of the nation. Which leaves us with this final, really powerful question from the source material. We always hear that history is written by the victors, right? So what happens when the story is retold by everyone else? It suggests that history isn't just some dusty thing that happened in the past. It's an active story we tell ourselves, right now, in the present. And if that story has only ever been told from one side, maybe it's time we started listening to the others. Thanks for joining this explainer.